In this video we look at relative frequencies and how to look at a relative frequency histogram, but also a polygon. So here's an example where we have the price of some items and the number of items that are available at those prices. So the prices go basically from $5 to $10. We need to have, I couldn't just say $5 to $10, because if I did that, then we wouldn't be sure which category the $10 item went in. So we need to kind of indicate some way of showing how we decide which item goes into which bin here. So I just chose to go from $5 to $9.99. We could have done this differently and it would have been just fine. So, and you can see all of the different items, prices, but also the number of items listed in this column. So I want to talk a little bit about relative frequency. So the relative frequency gives us an idea of what fraction or what percentage of items fall into each category. In order to find the relative frequency here from the $5 to $9.99 category, we take the number of items and we divide by the total number of items. So in this case, we'll take that 75 and we'll divide by the total number of items. It turns out that if we add all of these items up, so we calculate the sum of that column, we'll see that there are 300 items in total. So the relative frequency here for the $5 to $9.99 items is 75. Let's try that again. 75 out of 300. So we're just going to write that in as 75 out of 300. We could convert that to a decimal or a percent if we really wanted to. I'll write it as a decimal. It'll just help us graph a little bit easier. Sorry, that looks a little bit like 360, but that is actually 300. So if we convert that to a decimal, we get 0.25. And we can do the same thing for the other rows in this table. So 120 out of 300. And again, we can change that to a decimal and we'll get 0.4. And then we're back to the 75 out of 300. Which again is 0.25. And last but not least, we have 30 out of 300, which is the same as 0.1. Now, one thing that you should notice here is that these are all of the possible outcomes. So these are all of the prices and all of the items. So this column here should add up to 1. Whether we do it as a decimal or as a fraction doesn't really matter. I'm seeing here 0.25 and 0.25 is 0.5. 0.4 and 0.1 is also 0.5, so 0.5 plus 0.5 gives us 1. We could also add the numerators in our fractions. Take all of these numerators, add them together, and we should get a total of 300 there. So that's how we find the relative frequency. It's a nice quick way to be able to tell what percentage are in each of the categories. I want to look at the graph here. So if we were to graph these items, we could have the price listed along the bottom here. I'll just do a rough sketch. Ideally, we do this maybe with a piece of graph paper, or even better with technology. But just to show you here, relative frequency. So this is a histogram. This is continuous data that runs right from $5 to $25 essentially. So I'm going to start at 5. And we'll go to 10, 15, and ideally these are all the same width. Each bin is exactly the same width. Because I'm just freehanding here, it might be off a little bit. Hopefully you get the idea. And here we're going to graph these relative frequencies alongside. So I'm just going to go up by 0.1. And the highest I need to go here is 0.4. So we know that this first bin from $5 to $10 is 0.25. So again, I'm just going to draw a bar, ideally with a ruler, or at least a straight edge. But I think you get the idea. So there's our first one. Our second bar is 0.4, so we'll just continue this all the way up to 0.4. And then we have a 0.25 again, so 0.25 was right in here. And the last one is 0.1, so coming across from 0.1, somewhere around here, we get this idea here. So this is a relative frequency histogram. We could also make a relative frequency polygon, and that relative frequency polygon is made the same way that we made the frequency polygon, is that we're looking basically at putting points at the midpoints in the bars and drawing a polygon for that. So we'll draw our polygon from here. So this would be like the midpoint of the previous bar and the midpoint of the sort of bar after the last one. We get this polygon that looks sort of like this. And it comes down to here, and then finally down to here. So there's the polygon right there. So really what we're trying to get to, and we're almost there, is we want to talk about a normal distribution, which is that sort of bell curve look. And we're getting close. We can see that this graph is kind of close to a bell curve. Ideally, what we want to do is we want to be able to find the area under this curve and use that to find probability. So we're close here with this. One of the things that we're still not quite ready to deal with is the fact that if we want to find the area, this bin width is 5. We know the frequency, the relative frequency, which will help us a little bit, but we still have the problem of the fact that if we multiply the bin width by the relative frequency, we're going to get a value greater than 1. So that's something to consider here, and that's something that we'll look at when we look at a normal distribution, or in GeoGebra we call that a normalized curve, which you've seen a little bit of already. So we'll head more into that a little bit later in the unit, actually, in the next lesson, so you'll have an opportunity to see what that looks like. So that's a relative frequency. I've talked a little bit about the normal curve. I didn't draw the normal curve. Maybe I should just draw in a normal curve so you get a sense of what it might look like. Normal curve would look something like this. We call it the bell curve. And the idea, this data is actually not too bad for, and I didn't do a great job there. We call it a bell curve because it kind of looks like a bell. But the idea there is that there are certain things that we measure that are normally distributed, and we'll talk more about those details. But you can see how a relative frequency polygon can kind of start to get at some of that, depending on what the graph is about. So today's work here was just to show you what a relative frequency polygon and histogram were.